The term Smash Killer was invented for clickbait. Thanks for clicking on the video, by the way. There's an entire game genre out there which, if you're not a fan of them, you might refer to as Smash clones, and if you are a fan, you'll generally call platform fighters because, come on, this is not called a Street Fighter clone, this is not called a Doom clone, and none of the people actually making these games, to the best of my knowledge, have ever claimed that they're actually trying to kill Smash. That was the internet's job, and hey, I'm on the internet, so today I thought it would be fun to take a look back at some of these quote-unquote Smash killers and see just how much Smash killing they actually managed to do. Let's get into it. We're gonna jump back a ways to start off with PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, released in 2012. It wasn't the first non-Smash platform fighter out there, but it was definitely the first one to really put the idea in people's heads on a broad scale that companies other than Nintendo could make games like this. I mean, if you want to get really pedantic about it, there were platform fighters that came out even before Smash did, but who am I, Coney, running his little hipster tournaments? No, I'm not trying to hit every target that exists in this video. So the first thing I noticed immediately when I put this game up is, it's kind of ugly. This game was released for the PlayStation 3, which is a console that I had and liked, but I've never really loved the whole PlayStation, you know, edgy, futuristic vibe. And PlayStation All-Stars really leans into it, which I think is to the game's detriment. It does have a killer opening song, though, I'll give it that. The visual issues don't really get better once you click past the title screen, though. My god, there is just no cohesive art direction between these characters whatsoever. You've got very cartoony, cutesy characters fighting alongside much more realistic, serious, gritty ones, and that's fine, plenty of games do stuff like that, but this one just makes no attempt to blend anything. Here's Sly Cooper with a big, thick outline shader, and here's a very ugly-looking Nathan Drake without one. The equivalent of this in Smash might be Snake fighting Toon Link, for example, and there, it actually looks pretty cohesive. Toon Link keeps the cartoony proportions, but he doesn't come in with the cell shading that he had in the Wind Waker, for example, which would make him look a bit out of place compared to the more realistic characters. The level of texture detail isn't too different between them. And another big thing about PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale is, man, it's sure missing a lot of All-Stars. Snake made it into Smash, but he would have been, if anything, more at home on a PlayStation crossover, but he's nowhere to be found. I can say the exact same thing about Cloud Strife years later. Spyro didn't make it in. Crash Bandicoot didn't make it in. That's insane. And to the developer's credit, this isn't like an oversight. They tried to make it happen and were rejected, but at a certain point, it's just like, man, is this concept even coming together at all? Now, when it comes to the characters who actually made it into the game, some of them honestly did end up surprisingly cool. Like, I liked Kratos, as did everyone with a pulse who played this game, because this is his jab, so man, I wonder how you're supposed to play him. And if you mash it, you get this kind of deal, and if you mash his up tilt, you get like an auto combo in the air, so he actually reflects some of that God of War style, at least what God of War was at the time this was made. And that applied to so many of them. For Nathan Drake's jumps, he hurls himself into the abyss just like he does in his games, and he's got a cover system he can utilize. I've never seen anything like that before. Ratchet and Clank's melee attacks all use the Ratchet, and then he's got a massive arsenal of weaponry to follow up with. That's exactly how you'd hope this character would play. They weren't all nearly that insane. Parappa the Rapper has this musical motif going on, I guess, but a lot of his core moveset never really seems to lean into the rhythmic or musical aspect nearly as much as I'd want, so they could have done a bit more there, even then though he's got like cool skateboarding attacks he can do, so he was still rocking with a lot of cool stuff, like basically every PlayStation All-Stars character was, but Kratos was still the one to beat. And I think easily one of the coolest characters in the game overall, so yeah, he was extraordinarily popular. It's a shame this engine doesn't really showcase it particularly well. This is what movement looks like in PlayStation All-Stars. You can roll and block, and it's got air dodges, but they're the Brawl style air dodges, and they really freeze you awkwardly in plays, and it's tempting to glance at this and conclude that it just wasn't designed for competitive play, which it was under no obligation to be, although the traditional fighting game veterans working on it would probably have something to say about that. What you can definitively say is that it wasn't emulating Melee's movement at all, which became the starting template for platform fighters later on, but not so much at the time, including in the Smash series for what that's worth. I think if you're making any platform fighter though, good movement of some kind is a golden rule, and I never really got it from this this one. Again, it was being made by a lot of traditional fighter fans, which generally move a lot stiffer, so maybe that played a role, who knows. Those FGC influences did some good too. There's some very cool, very un-Smash-like combos to work with, and they were doing stuff like balance patches and stage hazard toggles long before the Smash series got there, but if esports was something they ever had their eyes on, it just never really took off. They also made some really weird decisions with the controls, like putting grab on the right stick, which means that you can't do aerials or tilts with it. There was no reason to do that as far as I'm concerned. It's just to make the game feel different from Smash. On the topic of departures from Smash for the hell of it though, you may notice that there are no blast zones or ledges on this stage. I am actively trying to swim off screen right now, so how do you actually win then? Because Smash and the vast majority of platform fighters are essentially glorified sumo matches. Here's your zone, fight to stay in it, so take that away, what do you end up with? Well, as I hit my opponent here, my super meter starts building up in the bottom, and once it hits level 1, I can call in my level 1 super, and if I hit him with it, I take a stock. Each character has 3 levels of super. For Sly, his level 2 is this jetpack insta-kill thing, and then his level 3 fills up the entire screen, and if you click on an enemy, they die instantly, and that's it. That's the game. That's how you kill people. And personally, I think it kind of sucks, because here's the thing. Okay, I've spent a little bit of time fighting, I've got my level 1 super built up, I fire it off, it whiffs. Well, now my last bit of fighting has accomplished absolutely nothing for me. It was essentially just a complete waste of time, because if you look at these HUDs, one thing you may notice is there's no kind of percentage or life bar. It's literally just the super meter, which also makes all your attacks feel kind of weak and unrewarding, because when you do this kind of thing, it's not actually damaging your opponent, it's just helping yourself for a chance to beat them later, which is something that Smash doesn't do, other platform fighters don't do, other traditional fighters don't really do. It's its own system, and I appreciate that they're trying something different, but man, I want my hits to feel more rewarding than this. The change does put it in line a little more with traditional fighters in the sense that your combos are always going to be the same no matter at what time in the match you hit your opponent, compared to Smash, for example, which is far more dynamic. The combos you can do at early, mid, and late percents are all decidedly different, and some may even work for a very narrow band. That part's honestly totally fine. I obviously like the more dynamic combos given that I play a lot of platform fighters and they generally have them, but at the end of the day, it's just a different design philosophy. It's not really inherently better or worse. The other consequences of the super system though, yeah, they're too much. I don't like it. Like, the game has items, but what do? They give you a little bit more super meter than usual, I guess. It just doesn't feel that good. Honestly, if they wanted this traditional fighter influence in their game, I don't really understand why it couldn't have just used conventional health bars. They could even have kept the super system. It would just be a good way to take your opponent's health. The devs' logic was that anything more than a single meter on the screen would just be too complicated for casual fans who were only checking the game out because they liked Sly Cooper or Little Big Planet, but I mean, would it? Hey, I've never shipped a commercial video game, what do I know, but that still just seems a little strange. So, what happened? Did it manage to kill Smash? Given that this is a retrospective, obviously not, and I'm gonna start dropping that pretense for these. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale did okay. It had some hype behind it, and it managed to sell around 1 million copies, and plenty of studios would be thrilled by that, but when you're Sony, one of the largest video game titans, and you're actually trying to make a Smash killer, these guys really were directly going up against Smash. That's just not really what you're looking for. And Superbot, the studio initially bearing the brunt of the work on PlayStation All-Stars, was kind of thrown under the bus by a lot of accounts. Sony created them specifically to make this game, but also didn't give them anywhere near enough money to make this game. They jerked them around on things as fundamental as what genre it would be. It was originally supposed to be more capture the flag oriented, and some companies wouldn't give them their IPs to use because it was their first game. Some demanded too much money to make their character viable to include, and some demanded they use a wildly unpopular take on a character. They were involuntarily pushed into making a roster oriented more around advertising than pleasing fans, which led to a lot of backlash that they absolutely knew was coming, especially after the roster got leaked. And then, to top it all off, they were in the middle of working on the DLC cycle that Sony had outlined for them, and then, without any warning, Sony just cut all ties, and they were forced to cling to life as an indie studio for a little while before the writing was on the wall and they were shut down. So, bottom line, Sony created them, set them up for failure, and then punished them for failing. Lovely. And by all accounts, these devs really did seem to care about what they were doing. You've got those incredibly distinctive movesets that still feel innovative to this day. The stages blend franchises together, something that I still don't think anyone else has really done. They were heavily involved in their community. They never stopped talking to the players. The problem was that Sony didn't really seem to care all that much. The last gasp for the concept was PlayStation All-Stars Island a few years later. It was not a fighting game. It was not on the PlayStation, it was only released in Europe, and it was made mostly as a Coca-Cola advertisement for some reason. Yeah. After that, things quietly faded away, which was probably for the best. It's a game that you still hear sequel requests for every now and then, and I guess that could work if they were willing to revamp everything. And considering the climate's a lot less hostile towards Smash ripoffs as it was endlessly clowned on about at the time, that may well be an option, because a Sony platform fighter, if done well, really does sound like fun. Let's hope that if Sony ever does try again though, they actually try this time. On a slightly brighter note though, our next game is Brawlhalla, released for early access in 2014. Brawlhalla is a platform fighter in every sense of the term, but it's another game that breaks away from the Smash formula quite substantially in ways that I would generally say are more well considered compared to what PlayStation All-Stars was going for. It's an extremely air-focused game. You get more jumps compared to Smash, and you get powerful dodges, and it doesn't have ledges, but you can cling to the sides of stages repeatedly. It has simpler movesets than Smash, and Legends share a lot of overlapping moves, but in addition to stats and some certain signature moves, part of what distinguishes these characters from each other are what weapon classes they can wield. Everyone gets a couple to choose from, so Mako here can toss aside the Great Sword and then pick up these Katars, and then I'm gonna have a totally new moveset to work with. There is overlap in these weapon movesets as well, so overall, I still do think that the more traditional approach leads to more interesting characters, but there is a good amount of depth here, and the game lets you put together some really satisfying combos and strings, especially because you can do stuff like chase dodging, so you hit your opponent and immediately just burst rush after them. You can gravity cancel, put a platform under you so that everyone gets to use their grounded moves in midair, essentially like everyone's Steve. Not as good, but yeah, everyone does sort of get to do the block thing, which is ironic because Brawlhalla does not actually have any real blocking in it. It's all dodging all the time, and it's used in a lot of creative ways. You know, you can slide off platforms, you can do all sorts of momentum boosting stuff, so it feels actually quite good to control characters here. Very different than Smash, extremely different than Smash, and that's not a bad thing. If you watch competitive Brawlhalla, it has its own very distinct but very high level identity with a lot of really slick movement, and it's pretty cool. And I think that's a big part of the reason that to this day, Brawlhalla is actually doing extremely well for itself. It's the biggest non-Smash platform fighter. By some metrics, it's the biggest platform fighter. Even a decade after release, that's honestly really impressive. It's got the League of Legends accessibility thing going on. It's designed primarily for mouse and keyboard on PC, and yeah, sure, these exceptionally simple 2D puppet animation characters are not particularly sophisticated, but that also means no matter what kind of potato computer you have, you can probably run this game. So if anything, that's actually a strength. The simplicity of making these characters also means that Brawlhalla can have a very large roster, including so many high-profile guest slots. It's unbelievable. They certainly lack the thematic cohesion of a lot of other platform fighters, but I guess the theme in this case is just, who do you want? We have it. Now, in practice, a lot of these are just skins for existing characters, and that definitely works better in Brawlhalla than it would anywhere else. If Smash tried to pull this and make Darth Maul a pit skin, for example, I would be pretty annoyed. In this model, though, he was always going to be a fast character who dipped into sword and spear movesets, so making him a skin for a fast existing sword and spear fighter, I get it, it makes sense, but at the same time, like I said, each full character does get a few signature attacks, and they definitely could have taken those last couple of steps, right? Especially because the skins often get custom visuals for the signature attacks, and that's gotta be a good chunk of the work. It's cool that when you give Darth Vader the orb, he has unique particle effects that make it look like he's manipulating debris with the Force, but you know what would be cooler? Giving him a Force choke. Sure, would be nice if John Cena could do a suplex instead of just being a skin for the same character as Darth Maul? Okay, I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe it's a philosophy thing. The few crossovers who have gotten their own movesets are all Ubisoft characters who also publish Brawlhalla. Maybe the current system is just such a license to print money that they feel no need to do more work, and if that's the case, I get it from their business perspective, but at the same time, it's not my job to apologize for them. Regardless, at the end of the day, they're optional cosmetics in a game that already has tons of original characters, so it's not that big a deal. And sure, it would be great if when they said you can play as Master Chief, they didn't actually mean you can play as Isaiah, but that also certainly doesn't seem to have slowed them down. Brawlhalla has honestly had a hell of a run. It's still got a thriving esports scene, it still has tons of active players, and there's still not much overlap with the Smash world, funny enough. I feel like a lot of people who play Smash and other platform fighters, which generally more spring off from it, don't necessarily realize how big and impactful Brawlhalla is even to this day. And they did it by going in their own direction. Is it my go-to platform fighter? No, for essentially those reasons. The direction it does take is so alien that it really does feel quite strange if you're not used to it, and personally, I just like stuff like shield and grab based combat versus purely dodge based combat, and the art style, while it is charming in that flash animation, early internet kind of way, it doesn't really speak to me personally, it's just not my aesthetic. But nevertheless, it all culminates in an extremely accessible yet surprisingly deep game with a heavy focus on deep edge guards. That's a cool formula that I think maybe more than anything else on this list, you can argue did lead to kind of a smash killer. Not too shabby. Then coming up next, we have Brawlout, a name that I have definitely mixed up with Brawlhalla in recording sessions before. There are too many brawls in this genre, man. Brawlout doesn't really tend to get all that much love from hardcore platform fighter fans. I think a lot of that comes down to the character designs, these animal-based fighters, which, yes, is not the most original concept in the world, but at the same time, Rivals of Aether definitely got there first, which we'll cover later. Now, the characters Brawlout came up with do certainly have their own identities, but they're still not the most memorable designs to me personally. This is a very subjective area, obviously, but Paco, for example, he seems to have sort of settled in as their mascot character, and for him they went right. Frog, luchador, forearms. You can see the elevator pitch, especially because he's a grappler that uses his tongue, but the way it was actually done was very direct and literal without a lot of flair. These are the concepts, bolt them together, that's the character, and he's not the only one like that. You can give characters cosmetics, which I guess technically helps, but that's about as big a band-aid fix as I've ever heard of. The variant system in the game also gives things a lift though. Everyone has multiple clones available to unlock that change some of their in-game properties as well as their looks, and sometimes these can be pretty radical. It's honestly a pretty clever way for a small team to get extra mileage out of their characters, and I frankly think some of these could have been considered as the starting points. They also did manage to wrangle up some pretty cool indie guest characters, although these unfortunately don't get variants. Maybe because of restrictions on messing with IPs they don't own, I'm not sure. It's a shame regardless. When you add everything up, that's 10 characters in total plus variants for 6 of them, which is honestly not too bad for an indie game, but I still wouldn't call their roster its strongest point. Unfortunately, neither is the animation work. Some of them look okay, but overall, Brawlout characters tend to have what I can only describe as a very lurchy kind of feel to them. This Volt's up tilt right here, and until he actually hits you, it's not even all that clear what he's doing. The Drifter is a super popular character because he's Neon Marth with Fox specials. Of course he is. You're supposed to love him, and honestly, I do. He's fun to play, but some of these moves kill, and some of them don't, and I'd have a hard time telling you which is which. The stiff feathers over here are especially rough as well. There's no bending with the animation's arc, there aren't any motion smears to smooth things out. Yeah, they're all like this. This is what the entire roster looks like in motion, and on top of that, compared to a lot of platform fighters, it's pretty hard to distinguish characters from the backgrounds. I think some of these stages actually look good, but as far as I'm concerned, the visual clarity wasn't always as high a priority as it needed to be. This is another dodge-only game. You cannot block in it, and it does give you advanced options like wave dashing and wave landing. It feels okay to control. It's not the smoothest feeling platform fighter. It does give you some interesting movement options like the ability to wave dash and then mix your momentum up out of it, and that does feel pretty good. Actually, wouldn't mind seeing stuff like that show up more often, but so far I'm not really describing all that much of a hook for why you would play that game, and if I had to, I would probably go with the meter mechanic. That's the big thing I would say Brawlout does differently. So as you're fighting and you use normal attacks or aerials and things like that, your meter builds up, but then if I go to use a special move, it drains the meter. So that's the interesting trade-off that they're going for here, and it allows special moves to often be very powerful because there's a detriment to using them. The first downside to not having meter is some special moves need it to work properly, and the other part of it is that you can't burst. So if you have 50% or more meter, you can spin it on a burst, and then that's essentially a get out of jail free card, gets you out of a combo, halts your momentum, knocks opponents back, and you can even combo off it. I don't like that it's a combo starter. Using resources to escape a kill confirm is one thing. It's not the only game we're going to be looking at today that does that, but being able to kill confirm yourself, make your opponent's blow unsafe on hit, I'm not a big fan of that one. And then if you had full meter, you also go into your rage state for a few seconds, where your moves become more dangerous and your opponent's moves become less dangerous against you. I read a bunch of interviews with the Brawlout devs before I recorded, and I also constantly saw them emphasize how aggressive Brawlout is, usually in the context of removing shields, but I'd imagine the meter is supposed to play into that too. I've heard this kind of thing about shields before. Games journalists in particular always love to talk about how removing shields means speeding the game up and removing the boring parts. This comes up every time a new no-block platform fighter surfaces, and I'm frankly pretty skeptical about how true it is. Without shields, you lose a lot of your ability to close in safely too, and you need to retreat from projectiles more or get on a different plane from them, that kind of thing. And if you watch competitive Brawlout nowadays, I don't think I would call it insanely aggressive, especially because it's also so easy to attack and instantly retreat. A tactic that being able to dash into shield could come up pretty well. As for the meter, if that was supposed to play into the the aggressive aspect, I'd call it, at best, a brute force method. Sure, activate rage and you get more incentive to rush in, but your opponent also gets a lot less incentive to actually fight you for a bit. Fighting becomes sketchier when your combo can turn into their combo, it weakens edge guarding because bursting also saves you from special fall and gives you another resource back, and in the end, yeah, I don't find this mechanic very compelling. And it being the big new idea Brawlout brings to the table while also being kind of a miss for me, doesn't leave a whole ton of incentive to play it over its competitors. The game does have a few other formula shakeups. You can do dash attack specials, you can end jabs with their own dedicated specials, and some of these character movesets are legitimately pretty fun. I like the Drifter, I like King Apu with those Castlevania-inspired chain moves on his specials, but at the end of the day, I still can't shake this feeling of Brawlout seeming kind of like a watered-down version of other games. Having said that though, it's also a $20 game where all the character DLC is free, so the lower budget feel actually kind of makes sense. It's a lower budget game. And it's also worth pointing out that this is actually a reasonably fleshed out package. It's got some decent solo content, it's got a tournament mode, and it did okay for itself. It helps that it was also in the right place at the right time for some of that. It managed to get onto the Switch a few months before Smash Ultimate did, and largely in those few months of downtime, it managed to sell 50,000 copies. Plus it's on the other consoles and PC, so it managed to have a bit of a run. It's not particularly active nowadays. There still is a bit of a tournament scene, but it's a very niche thing, much more of a passion project. It doesn't help that it came out a bit before crossplay was the standard, so yeah, sure, it's available on a lot of platforms, but those platforms can't communicate with each other, so the community is always going to feel a lot smaller than it actually is, which makes the community grow smaller over time. Given that Angry Mob Games released Trinity Fusion, an entirely unrelated project not too long ago, and they've been supporting that ever since, and also that the social media and dev support for Brawlout has pretty much flatlined. There's a community branch maintained for tournament play nowadays. It's probably safe to bet that it's had its time in the spotlight. Giving Trinity Fusion a crossover guest slot would be a very natural play under different circumstances, but at this point, I'd imagine that window is likely closed. Who knows though? When I take everything into account, I actually enjoyed revisiting Brawlout a bit more than I expected, but at the same time, I can't really see myself coming back to it again anytime soon without a good reason. Not a bad game, but even for its time, it didn't feel like the most distinctive platform fighter out there, and as the years passed by, I only find it fading into the crowd more. But hey, for a time, it was the most dominant platform fighter on a major Nintendo console. Smash Killer! More Brawl stuff. I am begging you people, please stop doing this. Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl this time. This one was released in 2021 and developed by Fairplay Labs and Ludosity, who got approached to work on it because of their previous experience making Slap City, a goofy little platform fighter that I'm not going to dive too deep into for this video because no one's ever really called this a Smash Killer. Oh hi, checking in while editing. God damn it, Donkey. Alright, so, Slap City was made for 20 bucks and a pack of gum with crossover characters from Ludosity's catalog that most people have never heard of and is way better than it has any right to be. It's the only game in this video that replicates all cancelling from melee, but instead of reducing lag by tapping a button when you're about to land, it gives you a boost forward instead, turning a mindless technical skill check into an actual decision to make. It's got the clutch button that lets you like reverse moves and extend your moonwalk, and the characters actually play really well, and Ultra Fish Boon Jin 3000. If you're here for anything, you're here for Ultra Fish Boon Jin 3000. Slap City was made and sold for cheap, it was fun, and it got its own little dedicated competitive scene that Smash and other scenes popped into, so in other words, the game's good. I'm not changing my format again, and the comments better not give me any complaints. I know how long this video ended up now. It was supposed to be out a week ago. Because Ludosity already had success with one low-budget cartoony platform fighter, that made them ideal candidates to develop another one based around Nickelodeon characters, and oh boy, yep, well, looks like they stayed under budget. Mission accomplished. Even so, a lot of people in Smash and other platform fighter circles were genuinely interested in this. The developers weren't shy about the fact they were building it with competitive play in mind, and it had some clever twists on the formula. It had a strafe button you could use. That was something kind of unique. You didn't have forward and back airs anymore, but as compensation, everyone got light and heavy versions of aerials, essentially aerial smash attacks, so everyone ended up with one more aerial overall. Same for dash attacks, everyone got a light one and a heavy one. There were built-in rock, paper, scissors outcomes if different attack directions clashed. You could grab projectiles out of the air and toss them right back at your opponent, so everyone had a universal anti-projectile option. Everyone had universal cargo throws. You could pick your opponent up and toss them back and forth, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of interesting stuff here, but we start to run into the first problem. Everyone had universal cargo throws. This is seriously what the entire roster's grab game looked like, just this over and over again. And think of how much character or history can be conveyed with a good throw animation, and that starts to be a bit of a canary in a coal mine for a much larger issue with this game. These movesets were just not very good. A lot of attacks between different characters functioned very similarly to each other in ways that didn't really express too much about the underlying source material, except for maybe a surface level animation reference. Everyone's Brawling's light dash attack works more or less the same. They're intended to be canceled into other moves, so again, it's just homogenous. And a lot of those animations also just aren't especially well done. Like I said, this is a low budget game, and that tends to be one of the first areas to suffer when your budget goes down, and this is Huon demonstrating. He's a DLC character, so he actually got more time and attention than a lot of fighters did. It is a game that actually feels pretty good to control. It's got smooth wave dashes and landings, you've got air dashing in it, but the way those controls actually ended up being used wasn't really my or a lot of other people's thing after the game came out. The meta developed around these really explosive but repetitive combos where you would often just chain the same couple of moves together over and over, and I can get on board with some more explosive combo games, but this just didn't really feel especially interesting or creative to me, and given the way the game moved after it actually came out, I think most people tend to agree. There was some hype behind it. You saw people from other scenes checking it out, and that faded very quickly. It's such a unique feeling platform fighter that it still does have a bit of a competitive scene to this day, which to my understanding is still being absolutely destroyed by how busted Sandy is. But that's another very niche loyalist kind of deal, and realistically speaking, the game is dead. Now, let's be reasonable though, some of that's also because a sequel came out, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2, and it's excellent. Despite the 2 in the title, this was a brand new game built from the ground up, and it showed. One of the big ways that it shows is this game actually had money, so character models look way better. They come with costumes right out the bat. The original Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl did not launch with costumes. They got one each per character as DLC down the road. That's not good. Same deal with proper voice acting, something the original just launched without. And this is another area where it's not like the developers didn't know it was a problem. They wanted it, but it just wasn't meant to be. Now, to the team's great credit, they did eventually manage to get it in with an update through sheer force of will, but during the time everyone was actually playing this game, and I seriously wonder how many people were turned away solely from that, because my god did it make fights feel lifeless. Compare that to Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2, and the difference is immeasurable. Another immeasurable area is the quality of the combat. Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2, to me, feels much smoother to control than the original. Not everyone agrees it doesn't have the same kind of slippery feeling. It feels closer to Smash, including having fully analog controls now compared to the first one that was all digital. Some people did prefer the faster, jerkier motion of the original. For me, this feels way better. The mechanics are much closer to Smash overall. Everyone has proper shielding now, and they even have some unique little animations with them. That's a nice touch. Even if, yes, it can be kind of overkill sometimes and put style before visual clarity, that's not the only time in the game that happens. The original had a block button, which functionally worked pretty similar, but you couldn't roll out of it, for example. That's a thing now. Everyone has proper rolls and spot dodges again. You've got proper grabs and throws across the board now. Everyone has 4 unique ones. You've got a full set of aerials for every character. They had to get rid of the heavy dash attacks, but even without that, this is still a full, fleshed out set of platform fighter moves, and there's actually more. You have charge attacks, and they all work on the ground as you'd expect. You've got a full set. At the same time, though, you actually still get to keep the aerial charge versions from the original, so you now have 8 total aerials to work with. You can be doing so much no matter where you are. And a lot of these would just straight up be special moves in other platform fighters. Her upward variant spawns a projectile, her downward variant is this dive, so it opens up so much space for the moveset designers, and these movesets are fantastic. They might be my overall favorite sets of any platform fighter. I'm not even kidding. My main Korra here, for example, is just straight up one of my all-time favorite platform fighter characters, and I was not a fan of the original. I never actually watched The Legend of Korra growing up, but I did see a bunch of the original Avatar, and I loved those martial arts elemental powers, so hearing that she was going to be like a heavier take on Aang, I was really interested. But man, that initial reveal trailer with so many generic moves and no real flavor to any of them, it just killed her for me, as most of those reveal trailers did, frankly. Coming into the sequel, she still has a pretty simple moveset, but I'm actually totally fine with that. I always find myself gravitating towards simple characters, but she actually feels like a proper multi-element bender now. And that's enforced by her only real gimmick, her neutral air, which just takes on the elemental properties of whatever the last move you used was. And that's enough. That gimmick alone gives her a good sense of identity, and provided the rest of her moves feel good to use, which they absolutely do. I just love this moveset across the board, especially moves like side special. You can freely cancel out of it. That feels great to do. And then she's got this down special, this get over here kind of move. That's one of my favorite platform fighter attacks ever. And her kick gets even better if you start taking advantage of the slime meter, which is the big gimmick that Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 uses to make it stand out from other platform fighters. And as far as I'm concerned, it might be the best one. You build it up just by fighting, and you can spend different amounts of bars for different effects, and there are so many uses for it. You can transform your specials into slime versions, which are like EX moves from traditional fighters. So here's what my typical aerial neutral special looks like. But if If I do the EX version, it's this big spiking spout of water. This goes from a slow, steady move to a quick burst forward. You can use it to cancel your moves. I showed off this dash attack earlier, and by itself, it does look a little bit underwhelming, but when you consider that it's a big, persistent hitbox that leads into whatever you want, suddenly that kind of stuff starts getting a lot more appealing. You can use it to strengthen your shield so you don't get pushed back. You can use it to turn your normal air dodge into an instant burst forward. You can use it to make your attacks stronger. You can spend all 3 bars to unleash your super, and a lot of people don't necessarily think these are always as cool as they should have been. Korra's not the best example, admittedly. I think hers actually plays out pretty well. Let's go with Lucy Loud. I always heard her getting flack, and yeah, alright, it's not the most stunning animation on the planet, but overall, this is still probably the most natural feeling super or ultimate kind of system I've seen folded into a platform fighter. And then you can also spend 2 bars on a slime burst, which I personally continue not to be the biggest fan of, especially because in this game, it discourages you from doing the cooler stuff with it, and instead you have to hoard it like a dragon to stop your opponent from doing cool stuff. But at the same time, that cool stuff is so powerful that without any kind of counterplay, it would be very overbearing. And whenever you see an opponent who has slime versus an opponent who doesn't have slime, that regularly plays out. You can just kind of go to town on them. And honestly, I wish the power level of that kind of stuff was toned down a bit. It has been over time, to be fair, and you still want characters to be able to look cool. But I would still personally prefer if the game was just a little bit more honest. If that's the price you have to pay to have the slime meter in the game, though, I'm on board with it, because my god, this is a cool mechanic. After the initial success of the first game, the sequel got a larger budget, and the developers basically decided they wanted to make their dream game, and they just put in like every meter mechanic from every game they could think of, and it's honestly great. Don't get me wrong, it certainly doesn't have the budget to compete with Nintendo. There's still some jank in there for sure. Training mode characters just refuse to get off the ledge sometimes. That's been very annoying while I've been filming this section. But overall, they managed to create a very smooth, fun, unique feeling competitive game. They added a surprisingly good single player mode too, a roguelite, which is a great fit for the formula that also features a bunch of guest appearances from non-playable characters, all fully voice acted. So despite a few indie studio hiccups here and there, it still feels like a really complete package, and it's a lot of fun. So how'd it do? As far as I know, actually not great. It costs $50 for one thing, which despite all the good stuff I have to say about it, still feels like a bit much for this level of polish. Now, it is a far more justifiable price point than the first game. That was actually a travesty, but hey, people bought it, so I guess the publisher felt emboldened to try again. But if I had to guess, I would probably say a lot of people felt kind of burnt the first time around and weren't willing to do that again. On top of that, rebuilding the entire thing from the ground up came with consequences. A lot of characters from the original didn't make it back in because they couldn't be recycled. So you ended up with weird situations like all 4 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles technically being represented, but 2 different ones in each game, and there was a lot of fan outcry about that kind of stuff too. The DLC lineup, which was announced pretty early, also got a lot of flack. You had 2 different fire-based avatar characters, you had Rocksteady from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and you had Mr. Krabs. And he was an incredibly obvious and fitting choice. The other ones, not so much. Zuko gets a bit of a pass maybe, but as big as the Avatar series is, both Avatar characters and his sister, who is also a fire user, were already represented. Uncle Iroh was the last bit of DLC, and he came out not too long ago. Now, there hasn't been any official news on what the future of the game looks like, but given that there also hasn't been any more DLC announced, and that I know a lot of people who were working on the game were laid off, I'm gonna go ahead and say it's probably wound down except for maybe a patch here and there. Not a sure thing, but it seems like a reasonable guess. There was one other nice development for All-Star Brawl 2 though. It ended up on Xbox Game Pass, and being available to play for free on a service like that is honestly exactly what this kind of fighting game needs. It added a pretty substantial infusion of players back into the ecosystem, and that actually made ranked somewhat functional again. I did some tests before I started recording this, and in Pearl Tier, I could still actually get games with a pretty reasonable delay, and I'm really happy about that because honestly, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 is a game that deserves it. It didn't end up having a mountain of staying power, but there is still definitely an active scene around it, and I 100% get this one. Fair Play Labs, Game Mill, Nickelodeon, whoever's in charge of making this call, please just make this one free to play. It's too good to be locked behind that kind of price tag. It would go so hard, and you know it would. Free to play on Steam, Game Pass on Xbox, the full crossplay, and the good netcode the game has. That would be a platform fighter. Icon's Combat Arena is next, released in 2018. I followed the build-up to this game religiously as it was happening. It was developed by a new studio called Wavedash Games, and that name itself is already making a statement, and they were poised to back it up. It was a crack team of successful industry veterans leading the project and doing art for the project, designing the project, and on top of that, they also brought on some members from the, at the time, recently disbanded Project M development team, which, if you don't know, was a mod of Smash Brawl that made it play more like Melee, and it was the Smash huge game in the competitive world for a while. Everyone played it. So these were a bunch of people who loved competitive Smash, hated how Nintendo treated competitive Smash players, and had the ability to make a competitive platform fighter. Not just a competitive platform fighter though, a free-to-play competitive platform fighter on PC. They were actually going for Nintendo's throat. They're one of the games on this list that most deserves the title of Smash Killer by their own ambitions. And my god, after so many years of being shafted, it was genuinely refreshing and exciting to have developers just in the trenches with their community talking about things like wave dash lengths and how many reverse hitboxes a character should have. This was gonna be sick. And then the first character reveal dropped. Oh boy. Okay, let's just address the obvious here. Yes, the exact people you'd expect were upset for the exact reasons you'd expect, but realistically, that wasn't a very substantial group. The far more relevant and overwhelming criticism was, man, this character is unbelievably boring. Ashani here was the first bit of their game that they actually concretely showcased, and it put them on the back foot immediately. So right away, more development resources needed to be funneled into redesigning her, and she ended up better, don't get me wrong, but that's definitely not the position you want to find yourself in, and she still got a lot of flack for being generic, and unfortunately, that didn't really improve as more characters started coming out. Next up was Kid. A lot of people didn't like Kid. There was Zana, who I remember being described as a DreamWorks background character, and I mean, I hate to agree, but then we have Zurong, and actually, you know what? I think this one works alright. That's just talking about what the characters look like though, which, don't get me wrong, is critically important and can single-handedly make or break a game, but getting into actual gameplay, it indicates a wider problem because she's obviously going to be a sword character, you can tell that just by looking at her splash art, but she's not just a sword character. This is Marth. She's got a couple moves that are different. She's got kind of a Zero Suit Samus thing. She's got a burst option. Her neutral air's got a bit of a kick in it, and her back air is a stab instead of a slash, but yeah, who are we kidding? This is Marth. She's got the up tilt. She's got the up air. She's got the forward air. This is Marth, and maybe in a vacuum that would be more tolerable, but so many of the early characters worked like this. They said that Ashani was going to be a speedy brawler, so we knew there would be some kind of Captain Falcon influence in there. What they actually meant was, we're making Captain Falcon with a Falcon punch that you charge up, the EM punch. Now, admittedly, there are less exact one-to-one parallels on her compared to Zurong. She doesn't have a knee, for example. She does a punch instead, which, I mean, is just kind of Ganondorf's punch, but at least it's something of a break. She doesn't use the Falcon kick, and she doesn't have a command grab on her up special, but none of that really matters because the core of what they're doing with this character is pretty transparent. We took the most iconic Smash Brothers move and we designed an entire moveset around it, and they gave it to the Speed Demon futuristic character, they gave her Captain Falcon physics. She's Captain Falcon. No one's looking at this and going, oh, well, her forward tilt isn't a roundhouse kick though. And don't get me wrong, you'd better believe there are direct rips in here too. Kid was transparently the game's Spacey, which is why he's a goat. Get it? And yeah, in practice, a lot of his attacks are actually pretty different. He does a lot more head-based stuff because he's a goat. That's all fine, and there's also nothing wrong with making a space animal. It's a full-on thing in platform fighters at this point. Hell, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 had 2 of them, and I just spent the last several minutes gushing over it. The problem is when all your characters are coming out and they're all doing this kind of stuff, it makes you start wondering, like, why would I not just play Smash over this? What's the hook here? Because mechanically, Icon's Combat Arena is essentially just melee without the L canceling. It's got a couple twists of its own. I still really like their chain grab lockout system. You can do chain grabs, but every time it launches your opponent further and further, so you get that little dopamine hit of grabbing them back to back, but you can't do anything super degenerate with it. It's got gust shielding, where you spend some shield health to knock your opponents back, and that'll also reflect projectiles, which is clever, sure, but it's not game carrying. And sure, you've got some little departures here and there, but as far as the actual major differences, that's basically the list. So why would you play this instead of melee when all the characters are just melee analogs anyways? Well, the answer is they're not. You've got Raymer here, this completely original character who's got a lot of long, lanky normals, and then also his specials fire a gun. A bunch of them fire a gun, and you can do some sharpshooter stuff with bouncing bullets. You can shoot someone from high up in the air. Your Dan special's a grenade, and it actually interacts with your bullet's physics. You had Wei Shan, the game's other heavy, and he rules. Like, he feels so good to use. He's got this forward smash that's ridiculously over the top. He's got this command grab here. He's got this combo-based ground projectile. He's got this focus attack that can tank hits and comes with a built-in hitbox of its own. And yeah, Wei Shan just feels great to use. I don't really have any big notes about him. So there were really distinct, interesting, unique characters in this game that people would pick up the game just to try out. I think Wei Shan's probably the biggest example of that. The problem is they didn't lead with any of them. They mostly came out later into the game's life cycle, and being blunt, too late into the game's life cycle, and even when that free-to-play model was implemented, the basic derivative characters were the ones you could actually use, and the more interesting ones were the paywalled ones. The free-to-play model had some other issues too. They announced that the game was going to have loot boxes in it, and this was right at the height of that loot box controversy that eventually started pushing them out of the industry. That was not a good call. Maybe Wavedash Games thought it would work for them since it was working for Overwatch, because this game just got a non-stop barrage of comparisons to Overwatch, and it's hard to say that wasn't fair. First off, look at it. And then that also just didn't really seem to be that big of a problem for them. You would tune into one of the project lead's streams to talk about the game, and he'd be playing Overwatch. There would be snarky tweets about how the worst thing anyone is saying about our game is that it looks like Overwatch. That last one, if I remember right, happened after the name and logo reveal, because Icon's Combat Arena is not an especially inspiring name, and as for that logo, so you get the impression that between the free-to-play PC thing and the DreamWorks Overwatch kind of aesthetic, they were going for as broad an audience as possible. They really are saying, hey, get away from Nintendo, come to us, we'll treat you better. And it just didn't really work because the game didn't really have much to appeal to anyone who wasn't already a diehard competitive player, but then how much it was biting from Melee and that art style and the general unpolished quality of the game turned off a lot of diehard competitive players too. Because let's be real, this game doesn't look particularly good. A lot of the lighting is very flat, and then the animation work is pretty choppy, and it's missing some critical things like back jump animations. I remember this point specifically being brought up by the community, and Wavedash Games responded with "You're expected, oh don't worry, we hear you, we'll add it later," and it's like, no, you need to have this kind of stuff in the game before you showcase it. And this all came to a head with their big grand gameplay reveal trailer at EVO, which went down spectacularly poorly with the community because, yeah, the game was not ready to be shown. And apparently there was internal strife about this at the company. Some people knew full well it shouldn't be shown off, but hey, it's EVO, gotta get it out the door for EVO. And yeah, it was mostly just kind of a downward spiral from there. Wavedash Games had to go into damage control mode again. They hosted a big company-wide AMA the day after that trailer just went down like a lead balloon. The game came out, it got a pretty tepid response. It hung on for a while, but it was clearly not doing particularly well. The developers were genuinely interested in turning things around. There were legitimately very talented people on that team, but eventually they missed some kind of investor target deadline and the plug got pulled. And I think it's a shame because despite this game's many reasonably criticized faults, I liked playing it. It was fun. Yeah, okay, Zurong is Marth with a projectile, sure. I like projectile sword fighters, sue me. To this day, I think that Wei Shan is an absolute killer heavyweight among all platform fighters. I will die on this hill. And I like spamming my pineapple pizza emojis online. Online actually worked really well too. It was built from the ground up to incorporate it. They also made an extraordinarily stupid decision to artificially add input lag to offline play so that it would feel more like online play, which nobody liked, but as far as the online went, yeah, it was good. And this was still in an era before rollback was the standard. It's also worth noting that, like I said, icons came into the public eye not too long after Project M shut down, and there was some lingering resentment among the community that Wavedash Games had essentially forced Project M to die by poaching its members, and it probably wasn't true, and people at the company said they were also sad to see PM shut down, and they just reached out to a couple of its ex-developers, largely that they already knew personally, to come work on their new project, which I think is pretty believable. Of course these guys ran in a bunch of the same circles, but fair or not, true or not, I can't say with full certainty, but it doesn't really matter because the sentiment of PM died for this is something you heard a lot, and they never really managed to escape it. I don't necessarily think stuff like that is some kind of insurmountable obstacle though, and I also think that going in, a lot of their ideas weren't obviously flawed, which, if anything, makes this scarier. The concept of making a Melee clone, which despite what I said in this video's intro is a warranted term here, but making it free to play and making it a bit easier and choosing an accessible visual style that was widely successful in other genres kind of makes sense on paper, especially because the PM devs had gotten plenty of requests over the years to just reskin their game and avoid all of the Nintendo crap, which initially at least Icons wasn't totally doing, but it was certainly in that ballpark. And yeah, Nintendo really wasn't treating some of their biggest fans very well, but they didn't really have anywhere else to go. There was a legitimate market gap there. What Wavedash Games actually ended up with, though, was an existing Nintendo fan base who already liked Nintendo's aesthetic and characters and weren't given a strong enough incentive to switch platforms, and then a wildly different PC crowd who weren't given a good reason to pick up this game clearly meant for the console people. And everybody also had plenty of far more polished things they could be playing. I don't want to undersell what a huge factor that actually was. It was blindingly obvious how this was playing out in real time, and Wavedash Games obviously knew that too, but oops. Hindsight's 2020, and they'd already put massive, complicated plans into motion that clearly were not going to go smoothly, and it left them in this constant cycle of trying to dig themselves out of bigger and bigger holes until they were eventually buried. It still technically lives on today as Icon's Legacy Edition, which was a passion project thrown together by a few remaining developers, which is essentially the full game minus all of the free-to-play loot box elements and stuff like that. You get all the skins, that kind of thing. It's the version I've been showcasing, and I honestly think there's still fun to be had here. Don't expect too much polish coming in, though. Yeah, they did patch a couple of things up like the artificial input lag, but technically this game never really made it out of early access, so you get what you get. And also, if you actually want to get games, it's definitely one of those join the Discord kind of situations. And that should have been the end of the story, but one of the team members actually decided to buy the rights to the entire project and reboot it as Rushdown Revolt. Full disclosure, by the way, I did a little paid work for Rushdown Revolt. I commentated for them a couple of times and also some very minor consultation stuff here and there. It still keeps all the same characters, but reworks a lot of them. This is the newest Shawnee, for example. Kid was turned into more of this, I think, sadder kind of design. There are others like Weishan and Zurong who didn't need the same kinds of core changes to their models, but they definitely look a lot more expressive now. And then we've got some new ones. We've got Reina, this chain and knife fighter. Seth, an electric staff user who was envisioned as a fusion of Ashani and Weishan. And the Torment, who is big. The changes extend far beyond visuals, though. Zurong is still the resident sword fighter of the game, and she still has more moves that feel like Marth than anyone else on the roster, but she also is very much her own thing now. Not even the first sword fighter with a shine I've looked at in this video, but don't get me wrong, I will take it. With Icon's Combat Arena, I remember the devs responding to some of these movesets are too close to melee criticisms with, oh, don't worry, we're gonna give Zurong a down special that will blow your mind. And what it turned out they meant was, she does a counter, but she zooms forward a bit. And needless to say, people's minds were not blown. Every character in Rushdown Revolt has much more of a thing going on. So for Zurong, all of her specials have a red version, and if she hits an opponent, she also gets the blue version for a couple seconds. And then she also has those feathers at the bottom of her HUD, and if you land a blue special, she gets a feather. So you're intended to chain her normals and specials together fluidly. Her red and her blue specials all work differently from each other, and if you have one of those feathers, you can spend it on her projectile, which, like the rest of her, now has this phoenix motif. Unless she's going for the blue special, in which case it's this thing instead, which does not consume a feather and still has that old freezing property, and all the characters are like this. Weishan has what are essentially EX versions of all of his specials that he can activate whenever he wants because they don't cost meter to use, they cost him health. Even more impactful than character identity changes, though, were changes to the mechanics. So Icon's Combat Arena got some deserved criticism for playing too much like Melee. That is not something you can say about Rushdown Revolt. I might actually call it the single most unique game in this video. Nothing else really plays like it. It has slightly smaller movesets. For one, you don't have discrete tilt and smash attacks. You only have tilts that you can charge up, and that actually goes for aerials too. You still have a full set of those, and every single one can be charged up. It's also got a fairly distinct defense system. Shields only cover one side of your body, and you need to turn to not get crossed up, so it doesn't have rolling anymore. And it also doesn't have spot dodging, it has parries. You can do traditional wave dashes, but there's also just a dedicated rush button now. Not that you're not going to be doing those air dashes anyways, because you can get some really powerful attack options out of it. Damage also works a bit differently. Knockback doesn't scale up based on your exact percentage, it only scales up when you move into a different band of health. So you can see right now she's in blue health. I'll hit her again. She'll go into green, and now she'll start taking more knockback. And that applies all the way down, but there's one more catch. Rushdown Revolt doesn't have percentage that climbs, it has HP that drops. So I can hit Reina one more time here, and now she's still alive, but Anything else, even a simple jab, kills her. And I honestly think it's a really good system that leads to a lot of exciting moments. You get to have your Smash-style sumo matches, but fights are also prevented from dragging on for too long, and you also give players the chance to have big, miraculous comebacks. The more consistent knockback also allows you to practice more consistent combos, and oh man, are you going to need that. Hey, remember when I talked about how good it was to spend a bar of slime to cancel one of your moves? Rushdown Revolt's Spark system gives you a bar of slime every time you land a hit. And this creates absolutely unhinged combos that really aren't comparable to any other game I've played. That's Rushdown Revolt's entire thing. Nobody's safe at any time. You land a single hit, you're always landing more than one. And it's pretty exhilarating. It's a sugar rush, and like the slime system, it encourages you to look at your entire moveset differently, except that's taken to even bigger extremes here. Not just because you get to do it more often either, you can also spark cancel into a super jump, and that super jump can be done at multiple different angles. So yeah, land one good hit and you are just dragging your opponent all across the stage. As cool and distinctive and fun as the Spark system can be though, I think it ultimately ended up creating a bit of a conundrum for the game because Rushdown Revolt set out to fix a couple of Icon's mistakes. It wanted to separate itself more from Melee, and it wanted to attract a broader audience. On the first point, it absolutely 100% succeeded. Like I said, basically nothing else plays like this. That second part though, attracting a broader audience, no, this is like the sweatiest game ever made. Urda, formerly Zana, remains one of my all-time favorite platform fighter characters, and I had a ton of fun with Rushdown Revolt up until I started bumping into the hard ceiling of what my hands and reflexes would actually let me do. I look at what great or even just very competent gameplay looks like in Rushdown Revolt, and it's just like, you know what? I can't physically track what's happening on screen. Rushdown Revolt is another game that has burst, one per stock, no questions asked, but this time around, yeah, it absolutely needs it. Rushdown Revolt held on for a lot longer than Icon's Combat Arena did, and technically is still around, but is being developed mostly on kind of a volunteer passion project basis at this point. It never really did that well for itself, unfortunately. There are definitely other things you can point to. The bad taste that Icon's left in people's mouths created a stigma that Rushdown Revolt had to try and push past, and the art style I would definitely say was upgraded over time, but it's still not the prettiest game out there, and there are some polish issues. There were some strange business calls. Rushdown Revolt really tried to ingrain itself into the overall platform fighter community. There were a lot of tournaments hosted by them where they'd bring on big Smash casters and things like that, and that was all great, and the game actually seemed to receive a reasonably warm reception. I would certainly say warmer than Icon's, but then after one of those big marketing pushes, they just shut things down for a while. They may well have had to do it to conserve their resources, but that still sounds fairly death spiral-ish. They had a very convoluted business model at one point where the game was free to play, but you had to pay money to access online. People didn't like that, predictably. There were a lot of social media blunders. Kako, the guy who picked up the bones from Icons, was originally handling a lot of the social media stuff himself, and I've got a lot of respect for him. I appreciate what he did. It was admirable, but not to get too intense here, social media was not his strong suit. There was also an enormous blunder where at one point he was talking about putting NFTs into the game, and that created, appropriately enough, a revolt that was smartly walked back on because literally everyone said, no, walk it back, please, I'm begging you. But then they didn't really have a choice but to do the opposite and go on this big anti-NFT push, and that Streisand affected things a bit. And dude, I just want to play a platform fighter. Why am I talking about this? You had to create your own separate non-Steam account for a while. That's been fixed now, thankfully, but that was weird. So yeah, there were definitely things that could have been done differently all throughout this Icon's Rushdown Revolt saga, but the main takeaway I've gotten from it is, man, making video games is hard, because at the end of the day, what you were looking at was still a bunch of talented people coming together to work on something they were extremely passionate about and experienced in, and they were prepared to spend a boatload of money making their vision come to life twice, and it still ultimately didn't pan out. Twice. I still think that Rushdown Revolt in particular is quite a cool game, and so do enough other people that it actually still has the Spark League, its own little esports tournament series going on, which is cool. The guy who created it also went on to work on 2XKO, the riot fighting game, so he's doing okay. Still, I have a comp sci degree with a specialization in graphics and video games, and originally I really thought by this point in my life I'd be working on video games, but I gotta say, the more time I spend adjacent to the games industry, the happier I am I'm not in it. Multiversus, a game that was kind of released twice. It had a huge open beta in 2022, it was pulled down and went dark for a while, and then in 2024, it went back up. As far as upfront mass appeal goes, this is the one that I would say comes closest to directly competing with Smash. It pulls from the Warner Brothers catalog, which while in the gaming space, I would say stands a bit below some of Ultimate's biggest inclusions, still gives them a huge leg up over the more typical array of indie characters or completely original IPs, and that's bolstered by its presentation. Multiversus is a very inviting game. It's got a bright, colorful colorful art style that very successfully blends characters from wildly different worlds together. Combat is clean and readable on every single stage, and the characters are all fully voice acted by some of the best in the business, and they interact with each other in fun ways.
Oh man! I want a utility belt!
It's also kind of an interesting take on the platform fighter formula. It seems to pull more inspiration from Brawlhalla than anything else, between the focus on air combat and elaborate dodge cancel stuff, lack of shields and grabs, being able to cling to the sides of stages rather than using ledges. And on top of that, it also has far more of a focus on doubles than any other platform fighter does. Many of the movesets have attacks on them that will work perfectly fine by themselves, but are specifically meant to synergize with your teammate. That also plays into the game's Call of Duty-esque perk system. There are plenty of perks that provide more of a boost if you have a teammate, or even only work in doubles, and that last part I'm really not a fan of when it's tied to a character's signature perk. They only get a few of those, but overall the system is interesting. And a lot of these movesets feel great to use too. I love zipping around with Wonder Woman, it just feels so satisfying. She's got big weapon attacks, big shield attacks. She gives herself and her teammate armor, and then by tanking with that armor, she powers up her down tilt. They recently released Raven from Teen Titans, a huge fan request, and I love her aerials in particular, and she can send out a Raven, fittingly enough, to help her out in combat. Jason is seriously one of the coolest takes on a heavyweight ever. He maintains that slasher vibe of slowly advancing on you. Keep in mind, Multiversus has digital inputs. I'm not walking here, I'm running. But then, you know, he's got a teleport to get around projectiles, that's one option. And then his brutal dash attack also just straight up beats them. And once he gets in, he can go to town on you, including with some very creative references to his home series. And that's one thing that Multiversus does phenomenally well. These movesets have so much love and attention to detail in them. So getting people to try Multiversus, whether we're talking about the open beta or the full release, was not hard. The game had some of the best numbers of any platform fighter, period. The challenge came from getting those people to actually stay, because both launches of this game had some pretty substantial problems. I'm going to paraphrase a lot here because I already have a full deep dive review of this game up on the channel, but a lot of people criticized the beta's combat for feeling pretty insubstantial and flaily. Spamming dodges was way too powerful, characters were hard to hit, and even after you did, moves did low damage, and a lot of the knockback and hitboxes were tuned weird. The balance was often pretty poor, with some characters having incredibly degenerate stuff and others having almost nothing. It was also very clear that the game was heavily designed around doubles, where some of these issues didn't go away, but they were certainly less prominent. The thing is, this is a fighting game, and a lot of people just don't want to play doubles. Whichever mode you chose though, there wasn't really all that much to the game besides grinding it out, which, to be fair, it was a beta. But between some of that combat design and a lack of satisfying progression, a lot of people just weren't up for the grind, and the game started hemorrhaging numbers pretty fast. Make no mistake, losing a lot of players after your launch hype peak is par for the course for fighting games, but even by those standards, there was clearly something going on here. So yeah, like I said, they shut down for a while, which a lot of people didn't like. They claimed this was always the plan. If the game had kept doing great numbers, would it have necessarily stayed the plan? I don't know, but that's what happened regardless. And considering that they'd already opened up a shop and started taking players' money, as you'd imagine, those players were not thrilled. I guess that's the nature of the beast with a live service game, but I'm not convinced it should be, and life went on without Multiversus for a good long time. But then in early 2024, oh, what's this? Signs of life. And despite everything I've brought up, there was a lot of excitement in the air. After all, plenty of people, including me, did have fun with Multiversus, so the concept of this very community-oriented team taking all our feedback to heart and then going away and having nothing to do but enact that feedback and make the game as good as it could be was very promising. The first signs of trouble started a few days later. Multiversus dropped a big comeback trailer, and there were no new characters or anything. It was mostly about technical back-end stuff. Oh, you switched to a new engine? I guess that makes sense. Oh, you upgraded your netcode? I guess that makes sense. I'm sure it'll pay off, and by a lot of accounts, the netcode did need some upgrading, but this still seems like a strange, underwhelming way to reintroduce yourself. As far as core things that your average player would actually notice on a moment-to-moment basis, there really wasn't much. Yeah, sure, the lighting got a slight upgrade, but the game still looked basically the same, and there wasn't really anything wrong with it in the first place. There was a little bit of stage-related stuff in there, and as far as gameplay went, everyone had dash attacks now. That was actually cool. It was something missing from the beta version, and there were also speed changes. Oh God, why is this game so slow? Say what you will about the beta version, no one would ever accuse it of being too slow. In fact, if anything, it was too fast, but hardcore platform fighter fans tend to like fast. This is Tasmanian Devil, the fastest character in the game, and this is Multiversus's new speed. Now, I want to be clear about something here. I actually don't mind this. I think it's an upgrade. Like I said, the original was arguably too fast, it just felt unwieldy and jerky, and the final version does feel different from other platform fighters, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Movement still feels pretty good, and it has its own vibe, a little more traditional fighter footsies oriented. So sure, I was okay with it and am to this day, but a lot of people weren't. Leading up to release, more good stuff definitely did come out. We learned that defense was getting more depth with stuff like parrying and making dodges less abusable. We got some great character reveals. The Joker, voiced by Mark Hamill, yes, please. More characters, more stages, a proper single player mode, but the entire time, this incessant drumbeat of, why does it look so slow? Why does it look so clumsy? Was something they just could not shake. So of course when the game came out, oh, wait, they crushed it? Yeah, the Multiversus relaunch actually did extremely well for itself. A ton of new and returning players really wanted to check it out. Word of mouth around the game, though, was not so impressive, and there was a pretty broad consensus that it had released in actually a much worse state than the beta had. It turned out that Multiversus had ran into the same problem Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 did. Changing engines is extremely difficult and expensive and time-consuming, and if you're doing that with a relatively small team, there is nowhere near as much time to work on other stuff, and in fact, everything you already built needs to be rebuilt. And we're talking things as fundamental as, say, the control rebinding options, some of which were available in the open beta, but not at relaunch. These characters clearly did not have time to go through the retuning and rebalancing gauntlet they desperately needed. There was still a ton of extremely degenerate, broken stuff in here that no one liked fighting against. And people had not been shy about disliking it during the beta either. The fact that so much of it was still around was really discouraging.
We honestly can't wait to see what you come up with.
Rifts mode, the new single-player content, felt pretty half-baked. There was no option to pause and retry or exit a level, which was insane. That kind of stuff doesn't necessarily indicate malice or incompetence, though. It indicates a beleaguered, relatively small dev team trying desperately to get their game out the door on time. Now, what does scream malice is the monetization. This is a Warner Brothers title. There was always a good chance that was going to happen, and yep, ugly, garish shop, unrewarding progression, overpriced characters, overpriced skins. Routes in the Rifts mode were locked behind owning certain skins, which just felt scummy given how critical Rifts were to actually progressing your account, and the fact that they were insanely grindy did not help things. It stank of greed. Now, I want to be crystal clear. A lot of this has actually been fixed since the game launched. They give out more progression just by playing through the game. A lot of the more egregious technical stuff has been addressed. Characters have been rebalanced substantially. They added an auto-teching system to avoid extensive dare loops. I don't think it's necessarily the single most intuitive or elegant solution in the world, but it does work, and it actually let them retool some other characters to get more ground-bound setups. The game's pacing was also sped up a bit. Certain characters did get direct speed buffs, and they added in better versions of universal tech like wave landing and fast falling and short hopping, which definitely did make things feel a little snappier. And it's also fairly typical nowadays for the launch version of a fighting game to be quite a bit different than what it ends up as, but the reason I'm harping on about this kind of stuff so much from Multiversus specifically is because these issues were really severe and they were happening at the exact point everyone was playing it. And as a result, a lot of people came in and bounced right back off, never to return. The game has struggled to maintain a huge player base ever since. Now, I'm showing the Steam chart there, which doesn't paint the full picture. Multiversus is, of course, also available on multiple consoles, and even so, a lot of games would be very happy with a steady 1,500 to 2,000 kind of player base range, but Warner Brothers hiring Kevin Conroy and Macy Williams and Mark Hamill, Matthew Lillard, Tara Strong, with that level of polish, with that level of IP crossover, with that level of marketing, those aren't the kinds of numbers they're trying to hit. And this isn't guesswork or speculation, by the way. This is on the record. And while nowadays I would say the gameplay is in a much healthier state, you know, character balance is way better. They've added a new arena mode. Ranked is properly implemented now. Characters are easier to get your hands on. You can play all of them in training mode, which, yeah, that was another feature from the beta that didn't make it into the initial release. Even so, the game still seems to stub its toe every now and then to this day. They added a Fighter's Road feature recently, which lets you directly work towards unlocking a character by playing, but you don't get to choose who that is, so in some ways, this is actually a downgrade. There are certainly still technical problems. I can tell you that on my computer, every time a match wraps up, it stutters horribly for a few seconds, and it didn't used to do that. They're currently experimenting with adding colossal overhaul features like shields to the game without implementing grabs. Hey, editing check-in again. So shields are no longer experimental. Right as this video was winding down, they just straight up put them in the full game. So Multiversus unambiguously has shields now. They still work the same as when I first talked about them though, so I'm actually gonna opt not to re-record this section. And when I say something along the lines of, well, you know, they're an experimental feature, so I'll cut them some slack until they're fully in the game, I'm no longer cutting them slack. Now, the system they've gone with is interesting. It ties directly into the dodge meter, and everyone gets universal shield breaker moves as a workaround for not having throws. While I'm making this, it's still an experimental feature segregated from the main game, and you can tell. The current dodge meter display doesn't blend well with it, and the feedback for hitting a shield isn't that great, and the shield breakers are just adapted from everyone's existing moves, so the balance can be wonky. There's no universe where they're ever going to be as deep as proper throws anyways, and if shields do get into the full game, I sure hope grabs follow behind them at some point, but it's a start. And they do address some pretty significant issues like how strong burst attacks and projectiles are right now. I've seen very mixed opinions on them from high-level players so far, but I want to reserve judgment until they're actually implemented, if they are. What I can say though is that messing so substantially with your core combat after years of delay and months of post-launch work using band-aid solutions like shield breakers at absolute best indicates a lack of confidence in your formula. Better late than never if they do turn out to be the play, but it's a long way from ideal, and I'm sure the devs know that. This also happened on their official channel recently.
Today, we have Raven, the member of the Teen Titans and daughter of Trigon.
The person recording this was sick at the time, but oh my god, there's no contingency plan for someone else to do it. There's no one else checking the audio. Because yes, depending on your recording situation, you can end up with this, but it's an incredibly easy fix too.
Today, we have Raven.
And yet it somehow slipped through every safeguard and is currently being used to officially represent DC. And look, I obviously don't know how the behind the scenes of this kind of stuff works, and it's not directly related to gameplay, but this is troubling. I don't know what else to say. It's an indication that something somewhere has gone very wrong because this should never have been allowed to happen. It's completely unacceptable. At the end of the day, I still like Multiversus. It has smaller movesets, but it squeezes so much personality into them. Characters like Wonder Woman and Jason are some of my favorites to play in any game. And while I just talked down on the shields thing, I also admire the devs for being willing to take such big action. They're not deaf to the fact that the game has problems. They're willing to work on them, and a lot of that work has paid off so far. I said back during my initial review that I hoped Multiversus would remain sustainable. I still feel that way, but you guys are making me sweat a little here. You can't go anywhere, you haven't added Legolas yet. Alright, we're in the home stretch now, winding time back again to talk about Rivals of Aether, released for early access in 2015. Rivals of Aether is a freak. Here you've got Dan Fornace, this solo game dev who just likes tinkering with platform fighters for like school projects or to play with his friends. He made a Lord of the Smash, a Lord of the Rings one, and then he did this hypothetical what if Super Smash Bros. Was on the Game Boy demake, Super Smash Land, and that had Vaporeon from Pokemon in it, and hey, it had kind of a cool original moveset, maybe even a bit too cool to be locked behind someone else's IP, and he'd also previously made a game called Elementimals, which was all about animals with elemental powers, and hey, put those ideas together and you could have a cool little project going on. So he started working on it, doing absolutely everything himself. The only thing he didn't contribute was the music. Showcased this fun little indie pixel art thing to the world, people seemed to like it. And then it went on to have an almost decade-long multi-platform run with multiple spin-offs, and in platform fighter circles is one of the most respected, if not the most respected entries of all time. And I think that largely comes down to a couple of things. The first one being the movement. This game is largely modeled after Melee, but if anything, it feels even slicker to move around on. It cheats a lot for you. You can do a wave dash the more traditional way by just jumping slightly off the ground and then air dodging back into it, but you can also just tap jump and dodge at the same time while holding sideways, and you'll get a perfect one every time. And it's not the only game we've looked at today with this kind of system in it, but as far as I'm aware, it's the one that innovated it. It cheats on platforms for you too. Again, you can wave land by going up above the platform and air dodging down onto it, but you can also do a sideways air dodge while you're passing through a platform and it'll still give it to you. And that kind of leniency does definitely lower the tech barrier of this kind of stuff compared to its Melee inspiration, but more than that, you can just execute it physically faster because you don't need to wait as long to be on the platform, and it just feels so good and smooth to do as well. This game plays like butter. It's got some of your other expected tech. You've got great dash dancing in it, you've got moonwalking in it, you've got baby dashing, rival specific tech. That's a one frame input, and admittedly I struggle to do it on this controller. It's easier on keyboard, but I can't play keyboard to save my life. It does have a couple of quirks to learn. If you try and just dash back forward tilt, for example, you get a dash attack instead, but given how smooth wave dashing is, that's really not a problem. So yeah, overall feels great to control, but I said there were a couple of things that make it stand out. The other big one for me would be these character designs. Orcane is what Vaporeon Vaporeon turned into. So his entire game plan is based around putting a puddle on the ground, and he can detonate it as a mine. He can teleport to it, he can use it to power up his strong attacks. Here's what it looks like normally, and the powered up version. And bubbles are a big part of his theming, and he has all this slippery character-specific movement tech. You've got the bubble butt and the orca hop, and a lot of Rivals characters have specific tech like this, but it's something Orcane's very well known for. Then you have Zetterburn, the other original character, and he's one of the more blatant Smash translations. He's the PM Wolf, the space animal of the game. Rivals of Aether does take quite a bit from Smash for some of its characters' movesets, which I'm set up by default not to like, but here it does feel more like paying homage and putting clever twists on the formula rather than just not having ideas for the most part. Again, Zetterburn's a decade-old design, so I wouldn't say he brings nearly as much to the table as the later characters do. He's very much like a let's get our feet wet as a designer kind of character, but even so, you can see my quote-unquote laser here is lighting Etalus on fire, and I can then consume that fire with a strong attack where it does more damage and knockback. That's his gimmick. And he can also light the stage on fire, which will do the same thing. Back air lights you on fire, and up special lights you on fire. So yeah, even back then, they were already establishing, 1, the stage control aspect, and 2, the elemental gimmick that, to this day, every single Rivals of Aether character incorporates into their design. Sylvanos, my main, and the one who made me really fall in love with the heavy zoner archetype, is a great example because he spreads grass everywhere on the stage that he runs. And then you can exploit that grass to, for example, extend your Beast Dash, or you can expend all the grass in one go as a massive combo starter. Oh, and also his up special does this, which I think is pretty cool. You can cancel it too. And if you cancel it and go into Special Fall, you can still wall jump afterwards, because Rivals of Aether actually has quite a few mechanical changes compared to Smash. There are no ledges to work with, but everyone gets a wall jump, and you only have the one, but you do get it back if you're hit. And yeah, like I said, you can do it even if you're in Special Fall. In fact, that's a critical aspect of recovery in the game. There isn't the same kind of roll cancel stuff as something like Brawlhalla or Multiversus, but this is a game without grabs and shields. Instead, you have parries, and because they're pretty much all you've got and you can't even do them in the air, they're some of the more powerful ones in the genre. They freeze your opponent in place for quite a long time, so you can get basically whatever kind of hit you want on them. The one exception being jabs, which don't freeze your opponent in place, but they do make you invincible for a second, so you get to chase them down. So that means jabs certainly aren't a counter to parrying or anything like that, but jab checks, as they're known, are still a big part of competitive play. And one of the more interesting ideas behind these parries is not only do they reflect projectiles, but parrying a projectile again provides you with some invincibility to rush in and hit your opponent with. That's all great on paper, and don't get me wrong, parrying certainly does come up, but it's still ultimately a relatively slow, risky option, and it's in a game where movement is so fast that trying to time it properly can be difficult. And the dodges are also nothing special. In fact, it's quite risky to burn your air dodge because you don't get another one back until you touch the ground again, so in practice, that movement itself tends to be the defense of the game, which is what a lot of its players like about it. Defense after your hit is actually much more robust. Rivals of Aether has very powerful DI, so here's holding out on an attack versus holding in on the same attack, and on top of that, there's also drift DI, so not only do you get to control your initial launch angle, you also get to keep holding after your launch to maneuver yourself a bit more. So here is Maple holding out and continuing to hold out, and you can see she really goes flying off to the side. In comparison, here she is again initially DIing out, but then drifting back in after she's actually launched, and you'll see it's a wildly different travel art. And you kind of need those extra defensive layers, because for a game without any kind of super system or dodge chasing or anything like that, man, can offense be strong. That comes down to how movesets are tuned, which often have many attacks on them exclusively designated for starting and extending combos no matter what percent your opponent's at. But it also comes down to hit falling. This is a tech that's unique to Rivals and has become kind of the trademark for it, and much like the Wavedashing that preceded it, was initially just a hiccup in the physics, but this time around, the developers decided to fully embrace it. So whenever you hit your opponent, there's a brief moment of hit pause here, where both characters are locked in place, and then they get sent flying. And in Rivals alone, if you tap down during that hit pause, no matter where you are in your travel arc, you immediately get a fast fall. You're unfrozen. So, normal sharking from below? Not too bad. You can fast fall at a reasonable pace, I guess. And here's what happens if you hit fall it. So, yeah, you can probably tell there's quite a difference there. And of course, this has massive implications on everyone's combo game. How could it not? So, you've got a fast-paced, exciting, interesting, unique, but also extremely physically demanding platform fighter that's technically played a bit more optimally on stuff like keyboards because of the hit falling. And while diehards often enjoyed it, and it got a great reputation in platform fighter circles, it really didn't have anything to appeal to casuals for quite a while. Dan Fornace and his team started leveraging those initial sales to turn that around though, and I think the bombshell was Workshop. This was a Steam integration that let players develop their own rivals stages or modes, but most importantly, characters, and put them into the game for everyone else to download. And this is what made Rivals take off more than anything else. The fact that it's a sprite-based game made it relatively smooth and low effort to add meme characters, and that's the kind of casual appeal that Rivals of Aether was really lacking. Yeah, the default stages have some slightly wackier alternate layouts, but there are no items, and the recovery system can take some getting used to if you're coming in from Smash. Turbo-powered Ronald McDonald, though? Yeah, I'll play that, or at least watch it on YouTube. The workshop was a legitimately brilliant decision that propelled the game to its highest player base ever. It never took over the world or anything, but for an indie pixel art entry in a sub-branch of the fighting game genre on PC, that's a pretty respectable number. And to this day, the workshop has its own dedicated following that's essentially separate from the main games. Because yeah, don't get me wrong, there's obviously a lot of joke content on there, but there's also some really high quality stuff, both fan interpretations as well as original content. The developers also leveraged that renewed interest very well. They released a ton of DLC for this game, including 4 of the more high-effort workshop characters. That's so cool. They actually bought the rights to them and retooled them for fighting and folded them into the game's canon, along with rollback netcode, which they didn't launch with, but went back and retroactively added. That is a ridiculous undertaking. They released multiple spin-offs, Creatures of Aether, which came full circle on Elementimals, Dungeons of Aether, Lovers of Aether, an April Fool's visual novel. Not beating the furry allegations on that one. And most notably, in 2024, Rivals of Aether 2. Okay, I know the retrospective theme of the video is being stretched to its limits here, but come on, you didn't think we were gonna skip Rivals of Aether 2, did you? For all the praise I had to offer the original, I did have some problems with it. Having movement strong enough to be its own defense is good, but I never thought it fully compensated for how relatively shallow parries are. The recovery system was certainly unique, and a lot of people still to this day really like the lack of ledges, but personally, I always found the endless mix-up game that you had to play every time someone went off stage a little tedious. And while I enjoy good pixel art, which Rivals of Aether definitely had, it also started becoming obvious later in the game's life that the team's ambitions had started to outgrow what this kind of style could really express, and from the very beginning it definitely had been placing a cap on the game's mass appeal. Apparently Dan Fornace also had a lot of the same thoughts, because enter Rivals of Aether 2, a brand new game built from the ground up in the Unreal Engine, with shields, grabs, ledges, beautiful 2.5D visuals, the works. And let me tell you right off the bat, despite the new engine, this game feels every bit as good as the original to control. They even gave you an extra frame for baby dashes, so I can actually do them on this controller. And we have ledges now, which means that you have lost the ability to up special into a wall jump. That would just be a bit too much. You can still wall jump after other moves that put you into special fall though, so it's kind of a mix of the Rivals 1 and Smash systems. Speaking of which, there was a not insubstantial portion of the original game's fan base that wasn't exactly thrilled to see its sequel moving in a more Smash-like direction instead of innovating more. And I get it, but as someone who has the extremely controversial opinion that the Super Smash Bros. Series are good games that do a lot right. Shocker, given my job, I know. This just makes so much sense, and it maintains a lot of feel from the original. Hit falling is still here. You still got parrying, which can be done out of shield or as its own input, and parrying something restores your shield health. And Dan has said that if he didn't start making the first game himself, or things like grab animations and ledge grab animations took extra development time that he didn't have, that would probably be what the original looked like too. And even with these more Smash-esque systems, they still do some very Rivals of Aether-y stuff with them, so sure, you could just grab and throw your opponent, or you could pummel them first, but this pummel doesn't really work anything like it does in Smash, which is a fairly trivial, useless guessing game on how fast your opponent can mash out before you get to tack on an extra couple of percent. Okay, fine, that's a bit harsh. Sometimes it does stuff like nudge you just into combo thresholds or whatever, and there are some other corner cases, but by and large, it could be cut without changing much. And it's also yet another mashing system in the series, which is something that the Rivals games avoid entirely, and I vastly prefer that. You only get one pummel here, but it does 8%, and that adds up quickly over the course of a couple of grabs. And also notice that when I grab Loxodont, he flashes yellow, and that is chain grab lockout, but if I pummel him, it disappears, and now I can go for chain grabs. So unless you specifically have a very fast throw and are trying to outpace your opponent's reflexes in terms of which direction they DI, why would you ever not pummel? Well, because if they counter pummel, they break the throw. Well, okay, in that case, why would I ever pummel? Because you can also special pummel, which your opponent also gets a chance to break out of, but if they guess wrong on the pummel type, then you get a character-specific bonus effect. So Clarin gets to freeze her opponent in place, which gives her access to follow-up she wouldn't normally have. So there's a bit of an inherent mind game, and that's also affected significantly by the matchup. With Clarin, for example, her special pummel is so insanely powerful that generally speaking, as soon as you're grabbed, you just mash special and eat your 8% because the risk of getting special pummeled is too high. But that said, if both players know that's the standard play, man, It sure would be nice not to take 8% and get out of the throw. It sure would be nice to get that special pummel. And then for a character like Craig, that gets even more intense, where his special pummel is very good. He throws you as a rock, just like the rock he can pick up himself. But he also gets an awful lot out of that chain grab lockout removal. So if I go for 2 or 3 chain grabs here, am I going to go for the 4th? At what point do I pull out the special pummel? And then of course you can also just not pummel at all and guarantee that you get the throw off. Don't give your opponent a chance to break out at all. And you do see quite a lot of that too. But I think it should be clear that there's definitely a lot more nuance and interesting stuff in this system compared to Smash's, or really any other platform fighter with throws for that matter. They also have ledge specials now. You can do your standard get up attack, but you can also do a ledge one, which is pretty dramatic with Craig, or a get up special. If you're grounded, which you can now initiate yourself, you can pull out a rock in his case. Fleet, one of Rivals 2's new characters, can toss out food, and she can then take it, and she uses that food to empower her next arrow shot. And this kind of stuff is cool, but even by the time we're starting to get to ledge and get up specials, I think it's fair to say that the impact they have on moment-to-moment gameplay is fairly minor for the most part. Rivals of Aether 2 is not an insanely innovative game. Its mechanics do certainly hew closer to Smash. They removed Drift DI as well, for example, but the intense value that it does bring to the table is offering competitive platform fighter players exactly what they've been asking for God knows how long. There's no consideration of, oh, it plays great, but it looks weird, or it looks great, but the online sucks. It just does exactly what you'd expect it to. And I've heard so much vitriol over the years about how no one can replicate Smash, people need to stop clinging to Melee, there's nothing particularly special about it, let it go. No, Rivals of Aether 2 is the death knell for that kind of talk as far as I'm concerned. This game is euphoric to move around in. This is a great template for video games. Now, I have some concerns, not so much on the mechanical side. There has been a lot of debate among the player base about how strong throws are in particular, especially because grabbing beats options like shields and crouch canceling and floor hugging, which are also often called overtuned. That kind of stuff, honestly, I don't think it's that big a deal. It's been adjusted multiple times already, including recently. If it needs to be adjusted again, it will be adjusted again. Rivals 2 also has a lot less content in it than the original, yet another victim of not being able to recycle much of their earlier work. But hey, you know what? It's coming. The only thing that I think is truly unfortunate there is that they were forced to launch without tutorials, which is not lost on the devs. It's a game that looks much more expensive than its predecessor because it was much more expensive than its predecessor. It just barely limped out the door. It had to turn to Kickstarter to make that happen. I backed it, and I don't regret that at all. I've done a couple of projects over the years, but this is, I think, the only one that hasn't left me feeling burnt on any level, and it was extraordinarily successful. $200,000 goal, they raised over $1 million. The community rallied around the devs, and they delivered. That said, what they set out to deliver was a competitively viable platform fighter, and they completely crushed that, and absolutely nothing else. Tutorials were a feature that they really wanted to get in for launch, but they just straight up did not have the resources or infrastructure to make it happen, and that's a shame. Because they opened really strong. They're the first release from Off-Brand Games, a new publisher that has the muscle of some huge content creators, so it actually had a bit of real marketing behind it, and the game's style switch up inherently made it more widely appealing. And yeah, its launch numbers absolutely decimated the first games. And the first time around, those didn't even come about until years into its life when it debuted the Workshop, which Rivals 2 still doesn't have. But it will, and it still seems to be a case of so far so good. The game's already sold over 100,000 copies despite not launching on console, and is maintaining peaks that are around the peak of what Rivals 1 ever managed to achieve. It's united the competitive scenes of platform fighter fans in a way that I don't think I've ever seen a non-Nintendo game do. And yet, despite those successes, there's still that inherent sting of knowing full well that there are plenty of people who would have been long-term fans of this game, but they tried it out, they didn't really understand what was happening, they bounced off, and they will never come back. We're just dealing with that now. That legitimately sucks, but you know what? At this point, it's already happened. The devs just have to move forward and keep trying to win as many people over as possible with good releases over the years. Even that's not my true concern with this game. What is a concern is I don't think I've ever heard so many, "Wow, I love this game. Wow, I hate these characters" comments in my entire life. Now, yes, fighting game fans complaining about characters isn't exactly a rare thing, but I still think it's a bit of a special case here. And I don't necessarily mean strength. The game's honestly reasonably well balanced even in this early state. I'm more talking about the character's inherent playstyles. Why does Raster, the air fighter, have the best out of shield option in the game? Now, some of these, if the devs were so inclined, are reasonably fixable. Oh, what's that? You think Zetterburn's a brain-dead masher? Oh, what's that? You think Fleet's lame as all hell? Well, if there was enough need to take away some of their shield pressure or zoning power and reconsolidate it elsewhere, it could be done. I'm not saying that kind of rebalancing is a trivial thing to go through, but if you had to, it's not a catastrophe. Then we get to a character like Maple, though, who I've heard just so many complaints about, and I'm happy to join the squad on this one. Hey, you know what would be fun? What if we took the fastest character in the game who low profiles everything and gave her some of the biggest disjoints, and an outrageously spammable projectile, and a trap that she can hide behind. Oh, and make sure you don't get hit by the projectile, because if you do, those giant disjoints also freeze you in place forever, which notoriously feels excellent in a fighting game. Oh yeah, and don't worry, that trap that you can camp behind does the exact same thing. This combination of traits to me has always felt more like a thought experiment than a fully realized character, and yes, she did work like this in the original as well, and it was arguably worse there because you couldn't preemptively shield her amazing burst attacks, which she also has, by the way, but it's not like Maple complaints weren't a common thing back then either. All the Rivals 1 veterans had plenty of tweaks made coming in, and they obviously had grabs added and the new specials added, but not one of them were actually reworked in any significant way despite being completely rebuilt from the ground up, and personally, there are a few where I think that approach was kind of a mistake. Maple's one of them for me, and Raster's definitely up there too. He's been a consistent balance nightmare for the devs, and he's another character that gets a ton of complaints. You know, you need to end a lot of combos early on him, you can't really edge guard him, you need to spend a lot of the game chasing him around in the air. He gets a lot of cheese kills even after multiple heavy rounds of nerfs, and I can just keep going, right? Those incredibly interesting and distinctive and unique arcane bubbles, yeah, they're also infuriating to fight against and just got nerfed into the ground. Better not run into my jab. No, you'd better not jump into my up tilt. That's it, that's the ditto. And look, this is obviously subjective territory. Dan Fornacy, for one, mains Maple, so he'd probably disagree with what I've said. And when I make statements like this, I always have to ask things like, is it just because they're frustrating matchups into characters I play? Am I just not good enough to get it? I'm not a top player by any means. The highest I've ever gotten is Platinum, and there's no universe where I'm ever going to be able to try and grind for better. But then it's also like, wait, Platinum is about the top 5% of the player base. You can't make a character that starts feeling good above the top 5%. Maybe I'm just too good and I can't see the game from the average peasant's perspective. Yeah, you know what? Let's go with that one. People have also taken issue with some of the other Rivals 1-isms that made their way in, like all the hard-baked 50-50 setups so many characters have, how strong so many recoveries are across the board, making edge guarding often not worth it, which when combined with that strict combo move, kill move dichotomy often makes fights drag out because stray hits rarely lead to anything. Knocking your opponent off stage often isn't a win condition for many matchups, and when you add everything up, depending on your viewpoint, you could say there's quite a bit of fundamental stuff here the team's going to be wrestling with for a while. I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of it, but the main fundamental for me is, man, on a broader scale, Rivals of Aether 2 is a very good game. I think I can confidently say at this point that it is my overall favorite platform fighter. I still don't think it matches up to the sheer majesty of Smash Ultimate, but as far as moment-to-moment gameplay goes, I think it's gotta be the best I've ever played, and it'll be the gold standard that any future challengers have to aspire to. As far as those challengers go, there aren't too many on the horizon right now that I'm familiar with, certainly nothing on a Multiversus level scale, say. Combo Devils looks interesting. It's kind of a merger of traditional and platform fighters. It's got stuff like high-low blocking, magic series, a hard cap on your health. I'm kind of curious to see how much demand there is for a platform fighter that plays more like a 2D fighter, because those scenes notoriously don't really cross-pollinate too much. But looks like quality so far, worth tracking its development. Framemakers is in early access right now, being worked on by the same people who made the Super Smash Flash games, and it has some gorgeous sprite work and is doing the crossover thing with indie characters, including some others that were already featured in this video actually. They've made their engine available to support custom content, you'll love to see that, and it also looks like it plays pretty well. It's fast-paced, it brings in more indie characters for assists, that's a really cool hook. I say looks like it plays well though, because I decided to pass on this one until the full release. I was originally looking at the early access version, but seeing it come out with like unfinished sketch animations, that's a bit too early for my taste. I know they've gone back and filled in most of, if not all of that by now, but it's just a philosophy that I'm personally not that interested in, so I can wait. It's a pretty hefty project being worked on by an obviously talented team. Hope the time to cook pays off. I did play the prototype for Bite Breakers though, a team-based battle royale platform fighter, and I've been wondering when we'd see a battle royale. I knew it had to happen at some point. This one was made by the team behind Omega Strikers and uses some of its characters, and I don't know much about Omega Strikers, but I've got to say, that roster worked for me, and the gameplay formula did too. Like I said, it's still just a prototype right now that they say was thrown together to gauge interest in the idea. It's not even online anymore, and who knows if it will be again, but it still played pretty good, and the map had some smart design choices on it. I'll need a lot more time in the future to give a more comprehensive verdict, and I suspect that stuff like different character speeds and avoiding excessive downtime are going to cause some headaches down the road, but early impressions here are pretty solid. And then, of course, there were plenty of platform fighters that, yes, I just simply could not cover in this video. Sorry, the whole Smash Killer thing was supposed to give me at least some kind of scaffolding to work around, and it still ended up taking so much longer than I anticipated. Yes, I know Cartoon Network got there before Nickelodeon did. Yes, I know Kung Fu Panda made a platform fighter. Those kinds of things, in all honesty, don't necessarily interest me all that often. It's more the smaller things, your indie pogos, your roof rages. Beardbarian's a funny little entry that devs asked me to check out where you weave charms into your beard and use that to beat people up. Those are the ones I tend to find more compelling. It can honestly just be really difficult to fit them into content, case in point, but who knows, maybe someday. But for now, I think I'm pretty much talked out. We looked at a lot of platform fighters today, and most are fun, some are downright amazing, but smash killers. At this point, unless Sakurai retires and his protege does something truly horrendous, I don't know what possibly could. Thanks for watching, everyone. This video ballooned wildly out of control on my end. What did you think of it on yours? Likes and comments really help in YouTube's algorithm, so if you think it deserved it, much appreciated. You can check out another MockRock Talk video here, a video on MockRock redesigning Zelda below, and patrons, members, and subs get stuff like early videos and Discord access. Later, people.